Hello, this is my sermon on Passion Sunday. The readings which I'm referring to are from Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 to 14, and John's Gospel, chapter 11, verses 1 to 45. And just as the clocks have gone forward today, so the whole emphasis of John's Gospel and of our observance of Lent shifts gear now as we increasingly focus on the looming presence of the cross, hence the name Passion Sunday. In the verses just before our Gospel today, Jesus has been in Jerusalem, where the religious leaders have sought to stone and to arrest him. This passage is almost entirely focused on Jesus' power over death itself. Those famous words he says, "I am the resurrection and the life." And in the following verses after our reading today, they recount how the religious authorities now hatch the plan to put Jesus to death. So let us set the scene for our Gospel. We know of Mary and Martha from the accounts in Luke's Gospel. They are close friends and followers of Jesus, and so they naturally call on him when their brother Lazarus falls ill. Perhaps the pilgrims from Barnes, when they went to the Holy Land in 2018, visited Bethany. I remember going there on a similar pilgrimage, and it's both a real and a very moving place to go to. But when Jesus hears this news, he seems to respond in a strange and uncaring way. He deliberately delays going on the journey to Bethany by 2 full days. And to understand this, we need to appreciate how in John's Gospel, Jesus' miracles and words are all about the signs of the kingdom. They are about demonstrating Jesus' power over death as the ultimate sign in this reading, and one of God's care for all people. So it is not that he didn't care about Lazarus, it was a deliberate action to demonstrate who he really is. And as we go through the Gospel reading, we have a series of conversations that Jesus has with others. First of all, those conversations with the disciples. They're naturally frightened about going back to Judea and Jerusalem. And Jesus' response is that he only has a limited amount of time and he's going to use it purposefully. Then he says Lazarus has fallen asleep. And you might have thought by now that the disciples would have been used to how Jesus speaks in metaphors. But the disciples don't understand that he's talking about death. And there's almost a comedy exchange of reflections on the meaning of being asleep and on death. And then we come to the conversation with Thomas. And I like this one because he's so commonly known as Doubting Thomas, which is yet really very unfair, because here and elsewhere in the Gospel he shows great faith in Jesus, and here he shows his determination to follow Jesus even to death. This passage also counters that image of Martha as well, as somehow being rather inferior and practically minded in her faith compared to Mary. Here she shows great faith. It's important not to gloss over her sense of complaint as well. This is a central part of the Jewish and indeed Christian tradition of prayer, for example in the Psalms. We all have complaints and we must take them honestly to God in prayer, not brush them away, thinking that will offend him in some way. But she shows more immediate faith here indeed than Mary does. And then the conversations go on in the rest of the Gospel reading with other bystanders and friends, some positive, some critical. So let's just step back and think about the Old Testament reading from Ezekiel, because here we hear about Ezekiel writing as the Jewish people have been taken into exile in Babylon. And their whole world is being destroyed and their theology is being upended. They're in despair, just as many today are in despair in the face of the pandemic. Our way of life is being upended. Lives are being destroyed through the virus. and many more through financial disaster. So Ezekiel has the vision of the dry bones, this valley full of a massive army that has been completely obliterated. We have difficult news ourselves at the moment to comprehend. We indeed may feel dry, just like those dry bones. But God breathes his Spirit into what seems lifeless. What is impossible to you and me is always possible with God. And the word that's used here for God's Spirit is the same as used in Genesis for the very forming of humanity originally. God is breath as spirit, and as we think of our own breathing in and out all through the day and night, it is a sign of God's Spirit with us and in us now. And it's important to hear the words of Ezekiel, first of all, as a sign of restoration to God's people, a release from exile. Ezekiel's contemporaries would not have seen it as being about bodily resurrection. And so we mustn't gloss over the needs of so many today who are crying out for liberation in the way that the Jewish people were crying out for liberation then. But of course, as Christians, we can also read more into this as a foretelling of the resurrection. It reminds me of that great Stanley Spencer painting of the resurrection in Cookham churchyard, of the bodies coming out of the tombs, an affirmation of the reality of the resurrection. And so in this passage, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Now, these are words that are used at funerals most often, but we need to proclaim them in normal times, in everyday times as well. Because part of the current crisis that we are facing is our fear of this hidden force, a hidden force causing suffering and death. And this is natural that we should be disturbed by that. I understand that there's been a great increase in the number of people writing a will. And we should say that that is a good thing, because it is about having a realism about death, but also that we have a bigger story to tell, which is that death is not the end. Indeed, it is the gateway to the fullness of life. Jesus is deeply moved in the gospel reading, and he weeps. Why does Jesus cry if this scene is about a sign that he had intended to make? Well, in part he weeps at the failure of those who fail to understand what he is doing. But more significantly, he weeps at the disorder of our world and the suffering it brings. When we weep, if we are weeping at this time, or if we have felt like it in recent days, be it through pain or anxiety, frustration or anger or in despair, Jesus is weeping with you and me in that experience. And then we hear those words, Lazarus, come out. It's a watershed moment. I remember going to Wintershall in Surrey, where they performed the life of Christ, which some of you may have been to. A great retelling of the narrative about Jesus in the open air with actors from the local area. Lazarus in that portrayal comes out, and he is very gradually unbound from all that is constraining his entombed body. And you get a tremendous sense of the release that Jesus has brought to him. The release from the clutches of death, the release from all that is contrary to God's will. And just as Lazarus is set free, we affirm that for all of us, Jesus will set us free from the binds of death. And so on this Passion Sunday, we give thanks for the compassion being shown by so many in our country and around the world in the face of great difficulty at this time. And we know that Jesus goes with us in the suffering that we may be experiencing and that is being experienced by so many people. He is there in the midst of that suffering. But we know that is not the end of the story. We do not accept the finality of suffering and death. God breathes new life into the old bones, and he will breathe new life into our old bones. Jesus raises Lazarus. God raised Jesus at the resurrection. God says in Ezekiel, I have spoken and I will act. And he who is the resurrection and the life will unbind all that prevents you from knowing the fullness of life for which you have been made and loved and go on being loved by him now and always. Amen.